What's up, guys? This is Mitch from Board Co. Welcome to the show today. And today we're going to be talking about a subject that we get a lot of questions about regularly, that I've been asked about quite a bit. And it's dealing with how different boats compare to one another. In fact, of all the questions that we get at Board Co., this is probably the most prominent one, which is how does a Centurion or a Supreme boat compare to brand A, B, or C. And so I wanted to have that discussion today and wanted to draw specifically two different boat lines that there are a lot of different people that would be looking between these two different boat lines when they're considering purchasing one or the other. And I wanted to look at them, the features that they have, the specifics that are associated with each of these boat lines. And that the two we wanted to talk about today was Supreme and Moomba. These are both boats that are considered part of the value class line. And by value class, just meaning that they're boats that are not the highest end surf boats that you can buy, but they're certainly definitely not like low grade or cheap boats, either one of them. Both a Moomba and a Supreme are really top-notch, top quality boats. And so today in this discussion, I wanted to break down where these boats are similar and then what differences they have and what the pros and cons are to each one as far as how they perform and what they do. And so let's first talk about Supreme versus Moomba as far as just the company perspective and the philosophy that they have in how they operate or how they build and design their boats. So first off, Supreme is owned by Correct Craft, which is the parent company to Supreme, but also the towboat brands Centurion and Nautique. Correct Craft also owns a number of other different boat companies such as Basscat, Yarcraft. They own PCM engines. They own a number of different companies such as that all exist within the marine space. And the objective behind Correct Craft is they're building boats and designing things to try and help make people's lives better, make the world a better place. So they donate a lot to philanthropy. They're a privately held company, so they're not publicly traded. They care about a lot of things outside of just the bottom line profits of the company. But whatever profits they do make, they like to utilize those for benefiting other people and doing some good in the world, which is pretty cool. It's a great thing to work with them and to have that relationship with them when that is their ultimate end objective and their goal. On the other side of the spectrum is Moomba, which is part of Skier's Choice brand. Skier's Choice accounts for Moomba and Supra. They're also a privately held company similar to Correct Craft. And so they're not beholden to the same dictates as some other publicly traded companies. So there's other publicly traded companies within the towboat industry, such as Malibu, Axis, Cobalt, Mastercraft. Those guys are all publicly traded, and they have a different philosophy when they design their boats. Skier's Choice, on the other hand, as far as the towboat spectrum of boats, they're smaller. They're not as big as like Mastercraft or Malibu or Nautique goes. But they do things really, really well, and they focus primarily on just designing a really good overall quality boat. And it's just their overall design philosophy is want to make a boat that's going to perform well, it's going to function great, it's going to have nice features, but it's going to be built well and done well. I know a few of the people over at Skier's Choice. They're really great people, and they do a really great job. As far as the companies themselves and the design philosophies behind them, realistically, there's actually a lot more similarities between the two companies, between Supreme and Moomba, than there are differences. There's not any giant stark differences between the way these companies are operated or the overall philosophy that they have and how they go about conducting business or building boats. Both of these typically have strong relationships with the dealers that they work with, which is a really important thing, especially for you as a potential customer. Having the right kind of relationship between a vendor and a dealer is really key, so that if your dealer's ever in a place where they need to advocate for you on taking care of something, like let's say there's a warranty item or there's a unique situation that pops up or something, even though those may be rare, it's important to have a dealer vendor relationship that they can address those challenges, make sure that they can take care of you the best way they can, as well as have a boat brand overall that's not just building a good quality product, but has a long-term vision in mind. And by doing that, they'll not only build a great product, but they'll back it up as well. And that's the case with both Supreme and with Moomba, being Correct Craft and Skier's Choice. So that's first off there. Next, now when we talk about the product mix itself, let's first look at the lineup of the boats. So if you're looking comparing Moomba versus Supreme, there's a lot of similarities. Moomba does 6 models, Supreme does 5. they cover the gamut, and they have a lot of very similar models. Probably the two major differences are if you're needing a smaller boat, like let's say a 20-footer, Moomba builds a 20-foot model that's going to appeal to that group. So if you have a really tight garage restriction where you need a 20-foot boat, that's the direction that you'd want to go. Supreme only comes basically at a 21-footer. And then on the other end of the spectrum, when you go big, Moomba's biggest boat is a 24.5-foot boat. Supreme's comes in at just about 25.5 feet. So the ZS252 from Supreme versus the Mackay from Moomba. Supreme builds a boat that's a bit bigger than the biggest boat that Moomba offers. And then the rest of their lineup is actually very similar size-wise, as well as the overall design philosophy behind the boats. And Moomba doesn't really build a boat that's just a dedicated crossover series boat. So they don't build a boat that specializes in water skiing or something like that. Same type of thing exists with Supreme. So they're primarily focused on wake-oriented boats and similar size mixes between essentially 21 and 25 feet. And overall, when you're looking at them, in my personal opinion, if I'm looking and shopping between these two boats, when it really comes down to it, these would actually probably be the two that came down onto my short list. So if I was looking for a boat that's in that, let's say, $150,000 price range and under, I would primarily be looking between a Moomba and a Supreme. I personally prefer those boats versus something such as an Axis or a Mastercraft NXT or a ATX or something along those lines. I think that Moomba and Supreme build a little higher quality boat, as well as one that's going to perform better than those other ones that I mentioned. So now that I covered that, let's dive into the nitty-gritty details and talk about these two boats specifically and what you can see as far as the similarities and the differences when we get down to the product itself. All right, now before I jump into the specific details on the product or the individual boats, I want to first just point out that this is my direct opinions, and this is not necessarily reflective of even everybody at Boardco. This is just the world according to Mitch. It's also definitely not an indicator on Centurion or Supreme or the opinions of Moomba or any other different entities I'm discussing here. But rather, it's just my experience and what I've seen in my time spending in and on these boats, both in a showroom, at a boat show, on the water, all kinds of different places that I've had interactions with, as well as dealing with a lot of feedback from different people that I've had the opportunity to spend time with. And gotten to know these different boats. I'm going to try and point out the things that I think are just objectively verifiable. Like if there's specific data points to talk about, we'll do that. But if there's also some different items that are subjective, and there's going to be places that you may have a preference one or the other, and I'm happy to give you my opinion, but it may not necessarily be your opinion or may not be the opinion of other people that you know. So I want to point that out first. Now, jumping into the product itself, let's talk about the similarities between Supreme and Moomba, because realistically, these two boats actually have a lot in common, more so than probably most of the other boats in that same segment do. All right, so starting off, we're going to talk about the similarities between these boats. In other words, when you're looking at them, where are they going to be similar to each other? In a lot of ways, different from other boats that are in the same segment. So first off, let's talk about some of the different features that they have on the interior of the boat. We'll start with that one. And we'll start by talking about some of the different components and materials that they use. So as an example, both of them, Supreme and Moomba, are both running gator step flooring. It's the highest end foam flooring option that's available. It's not other different super cheap stuff or some stuff that's sourced that they're pulling out of China somewhere that's just kind of a knockoff version. It's the real tried and true gator step that's going to hold up really well. It also comes in lots of different color options and things of that nature. And that's available on both Supreme and on Moomba. Then when we're talking about the rest of the interior of the boats, they have a lot of similarities between them. One of the key features that they do run that is the same is they both run a sliding bench center seat section. There's some other boats that will have a center seat that will like flip around or something like that, where both Moomba and Supreme both use a sliding mechanism. There's some differences with that sliding system that I'll get to us for a second, but the overall design idea is essentially the same. The next thing is we're talking about is the towers. So they have a little different look to them, but actually both Supreme and Moomba, to my understanding, both use the same tower supplier that builds their towers. They both are using Roswell designed towers, which are fantastic. They're super heavy grade. They hold up really well. They fold nicely. They look great. They're just overall a fantastic tower. Really about the only difference between them there is you have an option on Supremes to be able to do gel-coated tower panels. So you can take some of the look on the outside of the boat. Like if you have a red metal flake boat, you can put red metal flake accents in the tower panels, which is kind of a cool feature. But generally speaking, the towers are much more similar than they are different from one another. Also connected with that, with the towers, is the audio system. Both the audio on the inside as well as the audio on the tower. And for the most part, both of them are going to be running Wet Sounds audio components. They're very similar audio setups from one to the other. They're both going to deliver top-notch quality audio that's going to perform really well for you, and you're going to really enjoy it. The last thing I wanted to talk about as far as the similarities between the two boats is the dash system and the dash design. Really the only difference between them is that Moomba goes and has a lot of rocker switches that they run incorporated in with their touchscreen system, where Supreme is going to a pure touchscreen system that I think is a little bit larger than Moomba's. But overall, they're very similar designs. I think they even use the same software supplier on the back end. So they both do a great job as far as the dash screen and the interface there, and have a lot of controls. And there's some specifics with those controls I'll get into that are some differences, but overall, your helm design, your dash system, all those type of things, there's not a real major differentiator between a Moomba and a Supreme. They're both great on all of those categories and all of those things that I just mentioned. All right, so those are areas that I think there's a lot more similarities than there are differences. Now, moving to the next piece, which is areas of the boat that there are differences, but they're not necessarily better or worse than one another. However, each one of these has some pros and cons, but these are just ways that the boats just function and work a little bit differently from one another. First thing I want to hit on, since we were just talking about tower stuff, are board racks. Supreme is running board racks that are either bombshell board racks or skylock board racks, where Moomba has the option of bungee board racks, or they have the upgraded clamping board racks that are, I think they're Roswell Tritons or what they're running. But effectively, the main difference is both companies, you have an option if you wanted to spend less money to get bungee racks, or if you want to go to higher end ones, you have a rack system that's a clamping or a strapless board rack is probably the better way to phrase it, because it's not actually like a clamp system like some other board racks that are out there. So with those functionality between them, whether you're talking about bombshell / skylock racks on the Supreme side, or whether you're talking about Triton racks like you're talking about over here on the Moomba side, they're going to function about the same between the two racks. So the only real difference that you have between them is the angle that the boards are held. So the angle of the boards is basically straight up and down vertical on the Moomba boats, where when you swivel them in, the boards just basically come straight up and out of the racks, where on the Supreme end of the spectrum, the racks are going to be slightly more horizontal. They're tilted up just slightly, but they're more of a horizontal orientation. I personally prefer the horizontal orientation. We actually used to run some Triton racks like what Moomba has, and then they modified them and when it came out with bombshell racks and now skylock racks. Those ones have some advantages where they're more horizontally mounted. Those are, in my opinion, a little bit nicer, mainly just because when you swivel them to the inside of the boat, getting the boards in and out is a little bit easier. You're not having them get in the way with your speakers or other things like that. But realistically, they're very similar racks, just the overall functionality of how they operate. Next piece that we can talk about are the seat cushions and the vinyl setup in the boats. So between the two, the biggest difference you have is Moomba is now offering on some of their boats I think they're referring to it as Chill-Tech vinyl. But it's vinyl that the idea is that it's a thinner material that's specifically engineered so that it doesn't absorb heat nearly as much, where Supreme has gone different direction with what they went with the Comfort Strong and outside of the box vinyl options. Now, when we're talking about these, let's go through the differences between these two different vinyls. First off is the vinyl that Moomba uses, that Chill-Tech vinyl. It works great for its intention. So it's going to keep things cooler. So if you want to have like an all black interior vinyl color, it's going to really make it not unbearably hot if you're sitting with that in your boat, just because of that Chill-Tech technology. Now, the way that they develop that is to intentionally make the vinyl thinner and not as strong, not as durable, in order to make it so that it's going to be stay cooler when it's in direct sunlight. So there's some advantages to it, and it cools things down. The disadvantage is it doesn't hold up nearly as well. It's not nearly as durable or rugged and may not stay looking very nice after more than about a year. On the other side of the spectrum, you have the Supreme Comfort Strong vinyl, which Supreme kind of went the opposite direction. Rather than reducing the overall durability of the vinyl to make it so that it would stay a cooler temperature for the super dark colored vinyl, they ended up going, hey, we want to build the highest quality, best product we can, and we want it to be able to hold up, not just now, but for in the future, for future boat owners, make it so the boat's going to hold its resale value better because the vinyl is going to be in better condition when you sell it, things of that nature. So overall, it's much thicker, much more durable, much more resilient than the vinyl that's in Moomba. However, it will get a little bit warmer in the sun, particularly if you're talking about the much darker colors. So generally speaking, what that means is that you're down to two options when you're going into a Supreme. Either number one, you're going to want to stick with lighter or medium color vinyl. So browns, grays, things of that nature. Really would shy away from like an all black interior type color. We've done them before. They're really cool, but they're not cool if you know what I mean. They will get warm when they get in direct sunlight. So that leaves you with option number two, which is if you do want a really dark color vinyl on the interior, you would want to make sure that you have the double extra large Bimini top, and you would probably want to opt for the shade sail by So Long, which is kind of a different discussion, but it's an unbelievable piece of equipment that will basically cover the entire interior of your boat with shade. So if you're wanting to keep cool, especially if you're in a hot climate, like we have really hot summers here in Utah, if you're in, down in Phoenix, if you're in Texas, something like that, that's going to be where you're going to want some extra shade, or you're going to not necessarily want to go with all black vinyl. If you got to have black vinyl and that's a deal breaker for you, that's going to be a place where Moomba is going to win. For the medium colors and the lighter stuff like whites, grays, browns that are on the middle grade brown section, tans, things like that nature, there's really not much of a difference as far as the temperature of the vinyl because they just don't really get very hot in the first place. But if you get the super dark colors, that is something to be aware of. Those are the pros and cons when it comes to the different vinyl options and the different things that you're going to experience there. Next up, I want to talk about some of the different interior components where I think there are some clear winners and some clear losers. In other words, where I think one of these brands does a lot better than the other. When it comes to that, first thing, let's talk about things that I think Moomba does really well. They've got a couple different features that are really nice. Probably the two most prominent that I've noticed and I can think of is number one, they have some seat options where they have a little transom flip-up seat area. It's a really cool system that's available on Centurions, but there isn't necessarily a feature that's available on Supreme. So if you really like that, that is a really cool thing that Moomba's done. Other thing that you have is their transom walkway area that Moomba's done has also been really nice. So being able to go all the way through from the swim platform going all the way to the inside, that's a really nice feature where I'd say Moomba does a nicer job with that than what you get on a Supreme. On the other side of the spectrum, talking about what Supreme does a little bit nicer than Moomba, first off is the components that they use just overall through the interior of the boat. So just as an example, if you talk about the sliding bench seat on a Centurion, you're talking about a lot of metal machine components that are heavier grade. You just pick them up and feel them, and they're just a lot heavier duty. Where in the Moomba, it's a lot of more plastic stuff that's not going to be quite as durable, may have a chance of breaking. It's just a lot lighter weight. It's just one of those things you can pick it up and you can tell how well something is constructed and built. It doesn't really require having somebody give you the in and out details. You just feel it. And so that's something that Supreme does a bit better job, is just overall a heavier duty, higher end built boat in comparison to a Moomba. Next thing that we can talk about that's in connection with that are the seat cushions that are put in the boats. You can take and pick up a Moomba seat cushion. You can go and pick up a Supreme seat cushion. The Supreme seat cushions are realistically almost twice as heavy as what you get with a Moomba. Some of that has to do with the backing. Some of it has to do with the vinyl. Some of it has to do with the foam and the quality of foam that's in each one of the boats. With Supreme, for a higher density foam that's going to hold up better. It's going to maintain its shape better. And it's not going to sag and droop when you have people sitting in it. That's something that's going to be, in my opinion, is a clear win going over to Supreme. Last thing, talking about that, circling back to what we were discussing before when it comes to shade, the Bimini top setup in a Supreme is, in my opinion, not just a clear winner compared to Moomba, but clear winner compared to literally every other boat that's out there, including super high-end boats from Nautique and Mastercraft and Malibu. The So Long Bimini that you can get on a Supreme is just second to none. It's gives you tons of coverage area, super quick to deploy and fold up and get going when you get to the lake. It's got built-in heat reflective surf sleeves in it, so they're not just straps, but they're actually surf pockets. That's got heat reflective material to keep your board from getting damaged from the sun. It's kind of a work of art. It's an unbelievable piece of equipment, and something that would be the very first option I would select on my boat. And that may or may not have to do with my skin complexion about as much as it has to do with just how nice it is overall. So those are the areas that I would say are clear winners when it comes to Supreme. Now that we've covered the basics of the interior of the boat, let's talk about the performance and move to the exterior of the boat. And this is going to be where there's the real major differentiators between Supreme and Moomba that's going to come out. So when we move to the outside, there's a lot of stuff you can talk about, like the sides of the boat and some of the decals and things like that. That's cool. That's something that's just dependent on what you like the looks of, better or worse. I want to specifically spend some time talking about the running surface of the boat and the different design philosophy that exists between Moomba with their hull design and Supreme with their hull design. So Supreme, they run a hull system called the EZV hull. It's designed and built off of the Centurion OptiV hull, which was a hull design that came out initially back in 2017. It has been modified and tweaked a bit since that time, but it was probably the biggest innovation in hull design that's come around in the last 15 years on a wake boat. So that's number one over here on Supreme side. Over on the other side for Moomba, they're running, they don't really have a name for it or any kind of designator, but they have the Moomba hull design that is more of a flat bottom hull shape as in comparison to the EZV hull. So let's talk about the two different boat hulls. So there's two different areas to discuss when we're talking about the running surface of a boat, or hull is what I'm referring to it as. But what a hull is it's boat starting at the rub rail that wraps around it, going down from the rub rail and wrapping around the underside of the boat and the area that's called the running surface. So in other words, it's the part of the boat that's touching the water while you're driving along. And so obviously, because it's the part that touches the water, it's the part that's going to dictate what kind of wake performance you're going to have, how the boat's going to drive, how it's going to handle, what it's going to do, things of that nature. So in discussing that, there's two different areas in the running surface of the hull that we can address, and that's the front of the hull and the back of the hull. In other words, the front where the bow of the boat is, and then the second part is near the transom, or the very back of the boat. For those two different areas, there's a unit of measurement that's used to describe how the angles that sit along the running surface of the boat, and that unit of measurement is what's referred to as dead rise. So dead rise is a measurement of the angle of V that exists in that running surface. In other words, if you take a measurement device and look at the center line of the boat, so right above where the prop sits, and then you take a measurement at the chine, and what the chine is it's the area of the boat right where it goes from the V shape, and then it kinks up and goes up the sidewall of the boat. So that corner, if you will, where it turns up and starts to go up the sides of the boat, that's the chine. So if you go from the center of the boat to the very side of the boat, that angle of measurement, if you were to draw a triangle on it, how much angle that triangle has is the measurement of dead rise. So that we have dead rise measurement at the front of the boat, or the entry point. We have dead rise measurement at the rear of the boat, the exit point. If you're looking at the front of the boats, the two boats are actually fairly similar. They both have quite a bit of dead rise at the front. The dead rise at the rear is very dramatically different. So a Supreme has a 20-degree dead rise with the EZV hull. Moomba doesn't publish dead rise numbers because it's not really a unique feature to a Moomba boat. But their dead rise is probably sitting somewhere around 5 degrees. It's not much, and it's much shallower than what you get on a Supreme. So let's talk about that, and what that means and what that does, how it's going to impact different things. First off, let's talk about drivability of the boat. So a flat bottom hull like we see on a Moomba has a tendency to slide as you're going through turns, where a Supreme is going to track and bank the turns just slightly, more like it's driving on rails. Now, as far as which one's better, it kind of depends on what kind of conditions you're in. If you're in rough water conditions, driving on rails is really nice because it's not going to beat you up as you're going through corners. It's just going to track and handle well. If you're on really smooth water and you want to just power turn and power slide, that flat bottom hole on the Moomba is going to do that a little bit nicer. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're talking about low speed handling, this is one area where I actually think that the V-hull will handle slightly better. At low speeds, it handles maneuvers really well. It doesn't feel like it's wandering or drifting. So if we're doing things like putting the boat on a trailer or pulling up to a dock, the V-hull, in my opinion, just makes it a little bit easier, and it makes it less, there's less margin or less room for error when you're pulling up, because it doesn't want to have a tendency to drift or to wander. There's some boats that drift and wander much more so than others. The Moombas are not bad. They actually do pretty well. There's other boats that drift and wander significantly more than what you get on a Moomba, but it's still not going to track quite as well as a Supreme. Now, next piece is if we're talking about rough water handling, in other words, how the boat drives and handles when you're in really rough water conditions. That's probably the biggest effect you notice driving of the difference between the two hulls. The V-hull is going to carve and slice through rough water really effectively. The flat bottom hull is going to really slap and bounce. It's going to have a really smacking sensation. And think about that as the difference between trying to cut wood with a sledgehammer and versus cutting wood with an axe. You can have a sledgehammer that the head of and the head of an axe are the same weight, the same size, but the axe is going to slice through much easier because it's got some angle to it, and it's going to split that wood. Same type of thing exists when you're talking about water. It's the reason why all offshore boats, big cruisers, yachts, things like that have a V-hull to them. It just makes it so it drives through rough water really well. Now, having that front dead rise angle on the front of the boat does have an impact. So when you start talking about low speed driving in rough water, like if you're going sub 10 miles an hour, there's not going to be a dramatic difference between the two boats. When you start going much faster to where the water line is breaking about midship, so let's say 20 plus miles an hour, that's when you're going to really notice a difference. So if you're at cruising speed, that's going to be where driving a Supreme is going to be much, much more comfortable than driving in a Moomba, just because you're not going to get that slapping sensation because of the additional dead rise angle at near the transom of the boat. So let's talk about why each one of these companies would have designed their hulls that way. So the first one is that if you really go back to its original roots, the Supreme Easy V hull, it's designed and based off the Opta V hull from Centurion, which was based off of the older V hull technology, which ultimately ended up going all the way back to the original Centurion Enzo back in 2004. It was the first hull that they ever designed primarily to make it so that it would wake surf better. In other words, it would throw a better surf wave. Now, back in that time, we were leaning boats over to the side to try and create a surf wave. We didn't have anything like a quick surf technology or a swell surf system technology like you see on these two boats we're talking about. And so we were leaning boats way over to the side and people hanging off the towers and all kinds of crazy stuff we used to do back then. We were leaning it all the way over so that you could get more of the side of the boat in the water and clean up the wave on one side. The idea and design behind that original V-hull from the Enzo was that the V-hull will split the water naturally from one side to the other, and it will make it so that the wave will be able to clean up on the side that you lean it to, but it will also maintain more power because the water will be funneled directly behind the boat instead of splashed out the sides. All the force the wave would generate goes back to the surf wave, and that the wave itself would come off of the boat and stretch out longer behind the boat as opposed to curling up and just going straight perpendicular to the angle of the boat and just kind of fan more horizontally. That principle that came out when the Enzo was originally designed back in 2004, that still same principle exists all the way up to the current Easy V hull technology and Opta V hull technology on Supreme and on Centurion. They do that. The only difference you have now versus what existed back then is there's all kinds of other different contraptions and other tweaks and modifications of the hull to make it so that it will produce a really good surf wave and an even better surf wave than we experienced before, but you're not leaning it to the side. You're just using plates and different systems to direct the flow of water slightly from one side to the other. But the idea that the V-hull will naturally split the water to one side or the other, that same principle still exists. And it's the reason why there is V in the hull on a Supreme. The fact that it drives through rough water is just an added benefit. But the reason why they put that V there is to make it so that it would surf better. On the other side, when you look at Moomba, their primary objective with their hull design was to make it so that you have a boat that was a great wakeboard boat, also that would be a great water ski boat. And then they've added some contraptions and some designs with their swell surf system and such to make it so it will throw out a good surf wave. So when you look at between them, the primary difference is what the hull is intended to do. On a Supreme hull, they took a hull, designed it. They took a running surface, designed it specifically to surf better, modified it over time to make it so it would wakeboard better, and it will still throw out a good ski wake, but it's not really the primary design focus of that running surface. On the other side of it, when you look at skiers' choices design with Moomba and Supra, their primary focus was how can we make a boat hull that's going to do kind of a good job at everything. Great wakeboard wake, which it does a really good job on wakeboard wakes. We want to make it so that we'll also throw a respectable water ski wake, and then we're going to throw some contraptions and some systems on it to make it so it will throw a better surf wave. So that's kind of the design philosophy between those different hull designs, and it manifests itself in not just the performance that they generate, but also the systems that go on them as well. So you have like the swell surf system you have on Moomba is designed differently than the quick surf system that is available on Supremes. Swell surf system for Moomba is designed specifically to have different angles than what you get on the surf system from Supreme. Supreme is basically just utilizing a plate that's going to slightly shift the flow of water from one side to the other because the hull is doing most of the heavy lifting. On the other side of it, Moomba, their surf system is going to really pull and grab the boat so that it's going to shift the flow of water from one side to the other using those plate systems because the hull itself is not really going to modify the flow of water because it's essentially flat coming directly off the back of the boat. And so what you end up getting is really what it comes down to is before we start talking about ballast that goes into the boats, you're really discussing about one boat is primarily engineered as going to be a better surf machine. The other boat is going to be a better boat if you're looking for something that's kind of a jack of all trades. The biggest factor here is primarily the water ski capabilities. If you're wanting a boat that's going to water ski a bit better, that's going to be a discussion that you'd want to move in the direction towards a Moomba. If you're wanting a boat that's going to be primarily focused on surfing, but that you're also going to be able to ski, going to be able to wakeboard quite a bit, then moving over to a Supreme is going to be a good pick. As far as wakeboard wakes go, both boats are going to do a fantastic job. If you go all the way up to professional level riding, in other words, having a wakeboard wake that's going to be above the maximum level of stock ballast that each one of these boats can pack, that's going to be one area that the Moomba may actually show up and do a better job because it's got a flatter hull shape and it's going to be slightly less weight sensitive for wakeboarding when you put a lot more weight in the boat. On the other side of it, the Supreme is going to do a great job for wakeboarding, but if you're looking for professional level wakeboard wakes, I would potentially argue you wouldn't necessarily want either of these boats, but they're going to be, the Supreme's going to do a great job right up until that pro level wakeboard wake. So if you're going to be going out there doing 720s and above, wake to wake, that's going to be the area where a Moomba might be a good pick, or there's other boats that are going to do a great job, such as like an Axis in the same category. That's going to be a little bit better choice. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're going to be primarily surfing, wakeboarding at a high level and, doing flips and some 360s and 540s and stuff, the Supreme's going to be more than adequate for what you need. And then skiing, it's going to do great for just the occasional early morning glassy set. If you're going to be skiing a bit more, the Moomba may be a little bit better equipped to do it, specifically the smaller Moomba boats. Something like a Mondo or something of that nature that's quite a bit smaller is going to do a better job for throwing a ski wake. So that's something to keep in mind. So let's talk about ballast next, because that's the other factor that's going to be factoring into the performance of these boats and how they're going to wakeboard and wake surf specifically. So if we're talking about ballast, there's a fairly clear, obvious distinction that's really easy to compare, and that is the total ballast capacity between these two boats. If you compare them, Supreme has noticeably more ballast across the board. In fact, the smallest Supreme, a Supreme S220, is going to have 400 pounds more ballast than the biggest Moomba, the Moomba Mackay. So even when you go up to the 24.5-foot Moomba versus the 22-foot Supreme, the 22-foot Supreme is packing 400 pounds more ballast. So there's a big discrepancy there. And the general feedback that most people have is a Moomba will throw a great surf wave. You just have to add more weight to it. And when I say add more weight, I'm not talking about factory ballast. I'm talking about adding additional steel or lead bags into the boat. Or you could, throw some plug and play ballast in the floor of the boat or something like that to increase the total ballast in it. Or if you have a really, really big crew, that's another way of dealing with it. So, but if you're going to go out in a Moomba Mackay and you're going to have 4 friends and you want stock ballast, I've been behind one. The surf wave is surfable would be a way I would phrase it. It's not phenomenal just because it's a really big boat. It's got more ballast than some other boats that are out there, but it doesn't have a ton of ballast. It technically has more than a ton in a literal sense, but when you're talking about it doesn't have as much ballast as some other boats that are out there, and definitely not as much as I am accustomed to on something like a Supreme S240, which is packing 600 pounds more ballast than the Moomba. Plus the ballast is distributed a little bit different too, which is going to be the next thing I'll talk about. So that's something to keep in mind there. Supreme's going to pack more ballast right out of the gates. In order to achieve the same thing with a Moomba, you got to add a bunch of additional weight into it. So that's something to keep in mind. Next piece when we're talking about this is the ballast distribution. So Supreme separates their ballast into about 6 different locations on a Supreme, where the Moomba, you're typically dealing with 3 ballast locations. What does that mean and what does that matter? Well, the first one is that Supreme optimizes the distribution of that ballast so that it's got a little bit more ballast through the midship of the boat, as well as at the rear and at the front, where Moomba really splits it straight up between the back and kind of center line up to front, up in the bow tank. The main difference you end up having here is with Supreme, because those ballast tanks are more segmented and separated, even though there's more total ballast going in, because every single one of those ballast tanks is on its own individual pump system, the ballast is actually going to fill faster than the Moomba, even though the boat has more total ballast. So it's going to fill, let's say, 4,600 pounds of ballast faster than the Moomba is going to fill 3,800 pounds of ballast, fairly noticeably so, because it's split up into more individual compartments. Each have its own pump system. So that's one really nice feature. The other great thing about that is it's more distributed. So if you wanted to, empty weight on one side versus the other, you have twice as much pumping in or pumping out capability, which is just really nice for shifting weight around if you ever need to. So that's something to talk about. Now, one other piece to talk about here, and this is a thing that you probably have heard about if you're looking into Moomba much at all, is they have a system called auto wake, which the idea is you set your pitch and roll and effects of how you want the boat to be oriented as it's going through the water, and you do so so that the boat will fill and empty ballast dynamically in order to keep you at the same angles when you're running through the water. It's kind of a good idea. However, it really only is super beneficial if you're going to be running the exact same setup every time. The reason I say that is your angles can be the same, but if you're going out with 10 people, it's going to have a very different experience than if you're going out with 4 people. And what I have found with years and years of time spending out on surf boats and dialing them in for every kind of rider across the planet, including driving at world championship events and things of that nature, you're going to want to have the boat set up a little bit different depending on how large of a crew you have or how much weight you have in the boat. So the angles and the pitches that the hull is holding while you're driving through the water, throwing out a surf wave, you're going to want a different angle if you've got 6 people in the boat than if you have 12 people in the boat. And the reason why is because there's a lot more of that running surface that's down under the water when you have 12 people than there is when you have 6 people. So therefore, the hydrodynamics of how that water is going to flow off the back of the boat is different. So the idea and the concept behind auto wake is pretty cool. That being said, I know a number of people that run Supras, a number of people that run Moombas. The vast majority of them do not use auto wake. They just turn it off. So it's kind of one of those things that's a cool sounding idea that just doesn't have as much practical application. But if you're the kind of person that you go out with the same crew every single time and you're going to have people effectively running the same setup and doing the same things, it could have some application. It can be kind of a nice thing. It's not a detriment, to be fair. Like, there's no negative to auto wake. Worst case scenario, you just turn it off. But it's not a game-changing feature, I would say, in comparison to other different features that are available on the boats. So the last thing I want to talk about when we're talking about performance, and this kind of relates back to drivability that we were talking about before, is the engine options that are available in each one of these different boats. So the main differences that you have between them. All right, so the last thing I wanted to talk about in regards to performance is we wanted to specifically talk about engines and the power that propels these boats and how that operates, because there are some definite differences when we're talking about between Supreme and Moomba. They're running some different engines from different suppliers. Supreme uses PCM engines, where Moomba has engines that are available from Inmar. Now, the difference is there's different engine options available from these different engine manufacturers. And so that's something that I think is an important thing to hit on, particularly depending on what boat you're looking at and how you'd want it set up. If you're looking at a lot smaller boats and you're at lower elevation, this probably isn't a big deal. You're probably going to want to run the baseline engines anyway. In this case, it would be like a Raptor 400 in the Inmar application for a Moomba. And in Supreme, you're talking about like a PCM 409. Now, one thing that's important to discuss is that when you're looking at those numbers, they're measuring different things. So like a Raptor 400 is measuring the torque of the engine. The PCM 409 is measuring the horsepower. Now, the horsepower and the torque is exactly the same on a PCM. They're both approximately 410 foot-pounds of torque and 410 horsepower. On the Raptor side of the equation, or the Moomba side, you've got about 400 foot-pounds of torque, but you've got considerably less horsepower than that. The same thing exists when you jump up to the Raptor 440. In fact, if you look at the numbers on it, the Raptor 440 is fairly comparable power-wise to the PCM 409. PCM offers two additional engines above that 409, and that is the high output 450, which generates both more torque and more horsepower than the options that are available in a Moomba. And then the other one is you have a PCM ZZ6, which is a 6.2 liter direct injection technology, which delivers 465 foot-pounds of torque. However, it's got a much more aggressive torque curve on it that generates significantly more power. So PCM has two engines that are above the Raptor 440. Now, one option that is available that's in a lot of super boats, to be totally frank, I don't even know if it's available in Moombas. If you look all over their website and things, I don't believe it is, and I have never seen one in it. But if you're talking about the bigger boats, you might be able to opt for the 575 supercharged motor. It's a great engine. The only downside is that it's bigger and big price increase, as well as it's going to drink a lot more gas than other engines. So if it is available in a Moomba, which I'm not quite sure it is, then you have that option on the real upper end, where on Supreme side, you have two engine options in between the 440 and that supercharged 575. And then if you want to go, with big power, you do have the option of putting a 7.4 liter engine, ZR7, that you can put that engine into a Supreme if you really want it. It would be complete overkill and totally unnecessary, but you probably could arrange to do that if you wanted to for some reason. So when you're talking about those breakdowns, there is a fairly big difference as far as engines are concerned. One other big factor to bring into consideration is when you're comparing the two motors, one is done by Ford, the other one's done by GM. The general consensus that we hear from virtually everybody is the GM motors are notably quieter than the Ford motors are. That's something you just have to test drive them to see and to experience for yourself. But generally speaking, you have quite a bit quieter experience when you're in a Supreme with that GM motor versus in a Moomba with a Ford motor. As far as reliability and quality between the two engines, they're both great motors. So Inmar does a great job. They hold up really well. They're good quality motors. They're just really nice, and people seem to really enjoy them. Same thing with PCM. They're very reliable, very high performance, great quality engines. The main difference is just making sure that whatever boat you're looking at has an engine that fits the application for what you want to use it for. If you're going to be at high elevation in a little bit bigger boat with a lot of ballast in it, if you're wanting to throw out a big surf wave, having the ability to have a bigger engine is certainly a big plus, especially if you start talking about like a 6.2 liter direct injection engine that's going to give you tons of power, but also is going to be more fuel efficient while you're at it. So just something to keep in mind when you're looking between them. Overall, I think that kind of sums up my thoughts and opinions when you're looking at these two boats. If you're looking or having thoughts regarding a Supreme or a Moomba or really any other boats as far as that goes, you're welcome to reach out to our guys at Boardco. We're more than happy to help. I understand, and I am a bit biased. I represent a company that we do sell Centurion and Supreme boats and don't sell the other boats new, but I spend a lot of time in the others, and honestly, there's a lot of really good products out there. And what I've really found with my experience over time is that there's boats that have pluses and minuses in every area. Just because I may prefer a Supreme in some regards doesn't mean I can't recognize that like a Moomba has some areas and some places that are, in my opinion, a little bit better than what Supreme does. And so what it really boils down to is getting the right boat for you and your family, and finding what's really important to you, and going with the boat that's going to fit your needs the best, and also making sure that you have a dealer that's going to be able to back you up and provide the support and the help that you need so that you can have the most enjoyable time out on the water. So hopefully this has been helpful information. If you want to hear anything else or have any suggestions for any information you'd like to hear from us in the future, please reach out and let us know. Comment on any of the different channels, however you're watching the show, and we'd be more than happy to correspond with you, as well as potentially talk a little bit more on the show about things that you might be interested in. So thanks a lot. Once again, this is Mitch from Boardco. We'll see you later.